So I am going to talk about Detroit and learning from Detroit. And that's a very kind of audacious thing to say, right? Because for so many years, people have been looking at Detroit in a kind of strange way as they watched a great American city die. And the idea today that we might be learning from Detroit, not only in the level of experimentation that's going on in urban design and planning, but the idea that Detroit is poised to create possibly the most inclusive comeback story that we have ever heard of. And I'll explain a little bit why I believe that's the case. I'm going to talk about this incredible sense of resilience in this city. Next. And what is happening? And when I say trying to create the most inclusive recovery that we've ever heard of, this is Mayor Duggan. We just are enjoying our second term, and he is the first white mayor in Detroit's history in 40 years. And that quote, he's 57 years old, and he talks about seeing the population grow for the first time in his lifetime. That's one of his goals. But how he wants to achieve this is through creating opportunity for those who stuck it out with the city and create growth which is inclusive of everyone. And so there's a goal that we have a population of about 680, and the goal is to hold on to every single one of those families and yet grow the population. Next. And the vision, as it translates into our planning vision, is to create a healthy and beautiful Detroit built on inclusive growth, economic opportunity, and in an atmosphere of trust. And there's a lot in there, talking about Detroit and beauty, talking about growth but inclusion, talking about opportunity, and to do this in an atmosphere of trust. Detroit is undergoing an incredible renaissance of its downtown. And like most revitalizations, the heart of the city is the first to come back, right? It belongs to everyone. And so it's full of stories that are typical of downtown comebacks. The tallest building in Detroit is now under construction, done by shop architects in New York. It sits on an incredibly historic site of the Hudson department store that was imploded in the late 90s. So the symbolism of building the tallest building in Detroit on this site has enormous meaning. It's also full of other buildings that are now under construction, office buildings like the Monroe Block by the Copenhagen-based firm. And these, while they might be typical of other American cities, are highly, highly unusual. And it's been decades and decades since Detroit has seen vertical construction in its downtown. But it's also a downtown that belongs to everyone. And the symbolism of this image is probably maybe lost on many of you, but this is Cadillac Square, which is at the heart of Detroit. And here you see a summer day where young men are playing pickup basketball in the heart of the city. Now, I don't know how many American cities that happens in, but it happens in Detroit. And it's also a place with long-standing traditions. The largest slow roll in the country where thousands of people come together on their bikes and roll slowly through the city. It also sits on an international waterfront, an impressive transformation over the past 15 years, and yet the presence of private development is significant and has encroached on land that could and should be public. But this one, I got there in time to do an urban framework plan for the riverfront that instead envisioned pushing that private development back and to the edges and defining a great wetland central park on the Detroit River. And it means an enormous amount to give that public space, that public realm, back to everyone. And most importantly, that Detroiters can see themselves in this future vision of their city. So Detroit matters. It matters a lot. And there are some reasons why I think it's particularly important as an American city today. Like all great American cities, like so many great American cities, it has experienced an enormous tragedy, which has led to a rebuilding effort like it has never seen before. So whether it's the Great Fire of Chicago or the Hurricane Katrina of New Orleans, Detroit's great tragedy was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. So it hit rock bottom, and the stats are staggering. This was only less than 10 years ago, with a city with $18 billion in debt, a poverty rate of about 36%. They said the ambulance did not come. About 40% of the street lights didn't come on at night. And it goes on and on and on. And this is the equivalent of hitting rock bottom. But also, one has to imagine what would happen if a city was able to relieve itself of $18 billion of debt, and what might that unleash in the biggest city in the state of Michigan. And it's really, really big. Detroit is big. You can fit the city of San Francisco, the city of Boston, and the island of Manhattan into the 139 square miles of Detroit. And it was a place that was intended to have a population of millions. But today, from its high of 1.8 million, its current residents sit at 680,000. So about 1.1 million people over the course of 50 years left. And they didn't go far, and they didn't take their buildings with them. So what they left behind was a vast amount of vacant land. By estimation, there are about 25 square miles of vacant land in Detroit, and it is about the size of the island of Manhattan, if you were to aggregate it. And as you can see, it's not the next great Central Park. All scattered throughout this vacant land are tens of thousands of people who still live in very low density areas of the city. In fact, when I got to Detroit 3 years ago, it had all of 6 urban planners for the city. That's one planner for every 113,000 residents. And that's one planner for 23 square miles. So you can imagine not a lot of planning was going on in Detroit. The other thing that Detroit is, it's also blighted. There are over 80,000 vacant structures in the city, and it was not uncommon to have a blighted structure like this sit next to an occupied house on the same block. One of the biggest efforts that Mayor Duggan did in his first term was to demolish blighted structures. At the point of this calculation, over 7,000 structures were demolished, and it is going on today at a rate of about 150 structures a week come down. So, interesting dilemma, right? You remove the blight, and then what are you left with? You're left with vacant land. So as you succeed in removing unsightly blight, you create the next great challenge for a city of this size. But this is how the blight removal happened. It was federally funded with hardest hit funds, and the darker greens are the areas where it began, the demolition began, and interestingly, the demolition began in the most populated areas of the city, and then subsequently it spread after several years to the point where about 11,000 structures have been demolished, and all of these green dots represent the concentration of demolition that occurred. So what was the result of this? Interestingly, in the places where the demolition had happened, the property values began to rise to the point where Detroit is seeing an increase in its real estate value for the first time in about 15 years. So there's a direct correlation from where the demolition was done and the increased value in the land. Detroit is also Black. It's one of the largest majority African American cities in the country, with 80% of the population being African American, about 10% Latino, and 10% white. And there is a long history for this, and it certainly goes back to the Great Migration, when African Americans migrated to the north in search of good jobs. Henry Ford was one of the highest paying manufacturing jobs you could have, and people came by the tens of thousands. And in many ways, people talk about Detroit as having invented the African American middle class, because with that wealth, they built institutions, they built social clubs, they built churches, schools, and created Black wealth. They also stayed. So when many of the area population fled the city, the Black middle class stayed. They stayed to the point where they are now a majority of the city, majority of the 680,000 residents. But they stayed, shall we say, for a host of reasons. And I'll try to describe them. What happens in a community meeting in Detroit is easily 100, 200 people will show up. They will be largely majority African American, and they have a lot of the same expectations that middle class people have all over the country. They expect to have influence, they expect to be heard, and this South African slogan, "Nothing about us without us is for us," is probably their mantra as well as mine. But Detroit is also beautiful. It has created a host of artistic and culturally significant trends and movements, from Motown to iconic figures in athletics, and it's also physically beautiful. It has some of the most gorgeous neighborhoods that you can imagine. And all you have to do is look at these streets, and you can understand why people stayed. But you certainly, if you were to browse the internet, shall we say, these are not the streets that would come up. And I can assure you, these far outnumber the ruin porn that Detroit became famous for. Because it's ultimately about the neighborhoods. So if the heart of the recovery is in the downtown, and there's only one downtown, the soul of the city is certainly in the neighborhoods. And there are over 200 neighborhoods in Detroit. So the majority of my conversation is about how do you regenerate neighborhoods, and how do you include those who stayed in the process of regeneration? How do you make ordinary citizens equity investors in the recovery of their neighborhoods? So Ms. McClinton, she would get on her power lawnmower and mow her block, and take care of, be a steward of the land. And for many, many years it was perceived, that land was perceived to be a drag on the recovery. Well, I actually believe it's Detroit's competitive advantage. And in fact, families are coming back for those same very reasons they came in the first half of the 20th century. Opportunity, beautiful neighborhoods, and for the process of trying to make a quality of life that's anchored in the neighborhoods. Can you go back one? I was given the charge by Mayor Duggan to build the best planning department in the country. That was what he told me I was in Detroit to do. And then he asked me, what is it going to take to do that? And I said I could start by having an entirely new group of planners, because I only had 6, and I asked for 40. And he said, well, what are you going to do with 40? And I outlined in how we would use these planners and where I would hire them. And I told him I didn't want to hire 40 planners. I wanted to hire 5 city planners, and I wanted to hire 5 landscape architects, 5 historic preservationists, 5 architects, and 5 urban designers. And I wanted them to work in interdisciplinary teams. And much like that map of Manhattan, San Francisco, and Boston, I wanted them to be teams that worked based on region. And we created an office with 3 design directors who work with 5 teams, 5 team members that represent all of the disciplines that I thought was necessary to really attack the challenge. And then to think about things citywide, I wanted 3 divisions. I wanted an office of zoning innovation, yes, those 2 words can be paired, and historic preservation, an office of strategic planning and arts and culture, to lift up arts and culture, and then an office of yes. This would be an office that simply always said yes when partners came wanting to work with us in higher ed and in philanthropy. And then I wanted to build a planning department that looked like Detroit. And so we are well on our way. 60% of the hires are people of color. About 55% are female and in positions of leadership. About 30% are from the state of Michigan, and about 12 different languages are spoken. And I can't tell you how important it is in a community like Detroit, to have planners who can empathize and understand the residents that they're being asked to serve. And for those of you who know what the architectural and design fields look like, to achieve an office with 60% people of color is nothing short of extraordinary. And they've come from all over the country in some of the best schools and some of the best offices, both public and private, that are out there. In fact, only 10% have ever worked for a public entity. They're coming from the nonprofit and private sectors. And we have a few things that we believe. We believe in the democratic practice of design, which means you mobilize people to tackle tough challenges. And you have to be willing to give that work back to the people directly affected, and then to problem solve according to their values. So what that means is you must engage a community. And we do that at multiple scales in multiple venues in order to, one, show our respect for those who have been there. And when you go to a community meeting in Detroit, because you're dealing with that core group that would not go, you are likely to find people who've been in their house for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So there's no question about who is the expert when you go to their neighborhoods. And we meet them where they are. If it's the backyard of a community leader, that's where we'll meet. And it's always with the notion of learning and teaching. So this quote, and Benjamin Franklin said everything, but tell me and I will forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I will learn. So many of our meetings feel and look more like teach-ins, deep seminars, oral history exercises, and all plans that we do have a deep engagement at multiple scales, whether it's a focus group, advisory groups, town hall meetings like the one you see here, office hours in the neighborhood. We had a number of recorded storytelling sessions so people could just talk about the history of their presence in that neighborhood. And then when it's all said and done, we celebrate the achievement. Exhibiting the work at the end of a process. This is an example of 40 boards that were exhibited that looked at design excellence across the city, where residents could see the work in progress. So this is the map. This is one of the maps our office generated that looked at every single block in the 139 square miles and measured its level of vacancy or occupancy. So the areas that you see that are dark green have the highest concentration of population. The area that you see from yellow to red are the most vacant areas of the city. So it's really important when you begin to figure out where do you start in a city that have settlement patterns like this. Thanks. Well, the first map that I created was this one that basically looked at the areas where we believed density could be established. There was already a strong single-family residential population there. It suffered some of the same issues of vacancy, but this is an area of density. And in each one of those, the red lines you see are snippets of a commercial corridor. And so our first attempt was to get all development to start to coalesce into these areas of higher density. It's so much so that if you proposed a multifamily housing project outside of these areas, you would not get funded. As well as an area, again, these would be the equivalent of our kind of planning areas, areas again that are would be, in Detroit's term, low-hanging fruit. Still, the big challenge was to try to understand a conceptual framework. What type of strategies are there that are land-based that could fill in the space in between the occupied houses? And so I looked at everything from visionary plans like Broadacre City to some current ideas in Chicago by Marshall Brown's studio, Smooth Growth, to competitions, the Philadelphia Farmdelphia that looked at the role of agricultural land, to a manifesto that was authored by Rem Koolhaas and O.M. Ungers that talked about the city as a green archipelago. So areas of high concentration and density immersed in a system of green. Trying to understand what are the portfolio of land-based strategies that could drive redevelopment, mixed use and commercial development, but at a scale that's transformative. And interestingly enough, these examples that I found were mostly in Asia, some in Europe, but very few in our own United States. One great example of using green infrastructure to organize development is the water quality channel in Seattle, where this channel manages hundreds of acres of stormwater and becomes an amenity to organize development around its edges. And in Detroit, this was the vision of Michel Devine, the French landscape architect, for the millions of square feet of development that is imagined in the in the East Riverfront. Or using industrial land like the Railroad Park in Birmingham that reimagines that land as a public resource, but also catalyzes redevelopment. So this is the DeQuindra Cut, an old rail line just 10 years ago, and today this is the DeQuindra Cut. And it's about 3.5 mile bike and pedestrian greenway that takes you to the riverfront. Or the role of renewable energy. Can you use these type of technologies not just to provide energy, but to create place and to make place? And so in Detroit, we currently are developing a solar park. It's a 10-acre solar park, will be one of the largest in an urban neighborhood, and has a 4-acre park, an interpretive park, adjacent to it. Well, the role of urban ag, growing your own food. There are hundreds and hundreds of gardens in Detroit. They have not gotten to the industrial scale. So exploring what kind of acreage do you need to have this level of production. At current, like this farm, Muffy Farm, shows you the absolute beauty that the order of growing food can have as a kind of urban garden, urban productive garden. And then fifth, coming up with alternative land uses that may be temporary, as a way of creating stewards for the land, as a way of creating value in the land over time. So these strategies, like the next, imagine the reforestation. So this is not about food. This is about valuing that land and creating a signature that regenerates the city in a green way. So what I want to do is show you two neighborhood strategies that are regenerating. And they're based on a couple of simple principles, like this concept of the 20-minute neighborhood. Now, I first ran into this concept in Portland, Oregon. It's a very simple premise. The idea that all of the conveniences that you would need in your day-to-day life can be accessed in a 20-minute walk or bike ride from your home. So, very simple principle. This is how neighborhoods used to function. We are the modest city. So this was earth-shattering to people, that they would actually be able to walk to these services from their home. But we've had a conversation about what it means to be a pedestrian again, a cyclist again. And there's a reason to do it. It has to do with the 3Ds. What you need to support neighborhoods is density, a plethora of destinations, and a walkable distance to those destinations. So if you have those, if you have a concentration of destinations that people can and will walk to, you can create and support density and create and shape urban life. So that's the big goal. At the cornerstone of this concept is the residential street. So Detroit is blessed with tens of thousands of beautiful single-family homes that are on tree-lined streets, brick homes that were really under siege in the first 10 years of the 2000s. And it hit Detroit really hard, the foreclosure crisis, where tens of thousands of people walked away from perfectly fine homes that were underwater. And in the process, the very fabric of the city was frayed, and the accumulation of black wealth was under attack. And so we end up with a lot of homes that are not blighted, that are not beyond repair. In fact, you can go on an auction in Detroit and buy a house for under $10,000. And so these are the kinds of houses that are sold every day in Detroit. And so you can say the city is coming back one house at a time, but with 30,000 vacant houses, we need to move at a faster clip than that. But it has been working. 3,000 formerly vacant houses have been sold in this manner. And but then there's kind of going to the next scale. These two young entrepreneurs came to Detroit 3 years ago, and they started renovating houses by the block. So half a dozen or dozen houses to get a kind of synergy going. And they are now responsible for one of the largest housing rehab initiatives in the city. So the idea of doing one street at a time makes sense to me. The challenge was, could we do one neighborhood at a time? Could we go into a neighborhood and renovate every single house that was vacant and address the vacancy, the lot next door, at the same time? And that's the project, the first one that we've undertaken in the Livernois McNichols planning area. It's an area that is in a highly populated area outside of that dotted box to the north you see, and then all of the blue you see are publicly owned properties. So we zeroed in on this quarter square mile and wondered if we could, the city has control over 400 parcels in this quarter square mile. It's about 20 acres. There are about 600 households that are still there. And so the challenge was simple. Could we create a blight-free quarter square mile that you could walk for a quarter square mile in Detroit and not see blight, where every vacant house was renovated, and in every vacant lot had a garden. And this was the scale that we needed to operate. And it's a scale that's quite challenging. We couldn't find another city in America that could control 400 parcels in a quarter square mile, with every parcel having a purpose. But it's really important when you look at the institutional anchors that are on either side, a commercial street, which is at the north, and this walkable neighborhood at the center. So I've dubbed this the no-build option. Could you regenerate a neighborhood without building a single new structure? And the strategy is like this. Go in, rehab the houses. There are 115 houses in this quarter square mile. Use the income and revenue from that, the capital, to demolish those that are unrecoverable. And then when you inherit the vacant lot, you again use that capital to plant, in this case, 200 gardens, and create a cycle of maintenance. And to do all, have one developer do the entire thing. And so we set out to look for a developer who would take on not only performative landscapes, but would also take on the workforce component. So who's going to maintain 20 acres of gardens in a neighborhood? So there's a built-in workforce component. And the street, you can go to the next. An analysis was done, and the goal, the pretty audacious goal, was to displace, to have zero displacement, and to retain 100% of the existing residents. And that is both homeowners and renters. So there are 600 households here and 115 new households that would come as a result of the housing rehab strategy. And then there's some physical issues. All of the blue you see there is vacant land. Next. And so the Australian landscape architect Elizabeth Mossop, who also has an office in Louisiana, has been exploring this idea of filling vacant lots, not with buildings, but with performative landscapes. And what would it look like? What would the neighborhood look like if each of those lots had a robust landscape and a landscape function? And we cataloged the different dimensions, four lots, contiguous lots, 6 lots. What happens when you have an aggregation of 20 lots at the center, the green area, and then the idea of creating a land-based business model where there would be opportunities for land-based entrepreneurs to move into the neighborhood and create value. And so the strategy is literally like a quilt. And what you see here is the blue is a new central park, 2.5 acre park that goes across streets and alleys. The green is a greenway which connects the two universities through the neighborhood. And the various color gardens involve both crops or orchards or meadows. Next. And what it attempts to do is to take a land use that has often been the land use of last resort in Detroit. When everybody's moved out, people grow things. Could you take that same enterprise and use it to drive the redevelopment of a neighborhood? And Detroit, as I said, are full with hundreds of gardens. People garden. So could you take these gardens, some which look quite orderly, and others which kind of somewhere on the edge of orderly, and could you use them as the new neighbors that would populate a given neighborhood? So you take the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, and they have, they make jams, and this becomes the organizing principle for the neighborhood. So this is what this looks like when you have the flowering meadows, you have the productive landscapes, you have the park in the center, and next. And adjacent to those properties, you have rehabbed houses. So that's the home and garden strategy. So the landscape architect designed a typology for every type of lot. And the important clues that you see here, about 100 of them are flowering meadows. So the developer rehabs the house, and then takes the responsibility to install the garden next door. In exchange, they get to own both the house and the vacant lot, but they have a management and maintenance agreement where they're responsible for both. So this is 400 lots that are taken out of the public realm and put into private development. And then most importantly, the lots signal that someone is taking care of the neighborhood. So you don't have just a flowering meadow. You have a flowering meadow that is bordered with a fence, and there are 100 of these as patterns through the neighborhood. Some manage stormwater, some are productive businesses on gathering spaces. And the important issue here is design. Taking those urban growers and putting them in the center of a neighborhood that is regenerating, and then wrapping it with design so that, yes, this is a house. I'd buy a house next to something that looked this good. And that's really been the deciding component for residents. Is it beautiful? Will it increase my property values? Does it create social interaction? And so from my time in New Orleans, running the Tulane City Center, we did projects like this, urban farms that were architecturally exquisite, experimental, and added value. The other component is this is work. These are green-collar jobs to install these landscapes and to maintain these landscapes. So we've already begun working with the Greening Detroit, a nonprofit that trains low-skill residents, even returning citizens, in green-collar work, making a living wage. So imagine what it might mean to live in a neighborhood and to be able to be responsible for that landscape and to be making a living wage. The other component is to take the vacant lots that are strung together to become an exercise loop that connects the universities, but also provides a different kind of public space for residents. And this, again, is a greenway, one of the concepts to connect important components of the city, and it intersects an urban park. And this is the first time we've tried to take lots, there are about 25 lots, and aggregate them together across streets and across alleys to make a contiguous public park at the center of this neighborhood. Now, it took a lot of socializing of these ideas with residents because we effectively were not going to build any new housing. And so getting people accustomed to this idea of every lot having a purpose took, I would say, over 18-month period, about 90 meetings in every shape and form imaginable, with a hope to give an understanding of the work, not just to do the work, but residents understand this work deeply, so much so that when we had the developer shortlist, that image you see on the lower right is 200 people came out to hear the developers pitch their interpretation of this community's plan. And interestingly, the young men who won this commission were Andrew and David, who have been in Detroit all of 33 months, and they're doing the largest neighborhood regeneration project in the city. So the level, it takes a very special kind of developer, a community developer, to tackle these kind of very unorthodox strategies. So let's talk about, yes, that's David and Andrew, and that was the night of the pitch. So I'm going to talk about another neighborhood, Rosa Parks, Claremont, which has a really important history in Detroit. And this is the work of Walter Hood and Gensler Associates out of Chicago. It is another quarter square mile strategy, and it's surrounded by incredible resources like the Boston Edison Historic District to the north, the Henry Ford Hospital, Motown Museum to the south, and right in the heart of it is Herman Kiefer, which is a 800,000 square foot former hospital and 3 schools. It is also the center of the 1967 uprising in Detroit. Detroiters don't say riot, but rebellion. This was the center. This is where it was sparked and left a really vibrant commercial street, 12th Street, in ruins after the riots, and tens of people lost their lives. So today our strategy, again, build nothing new and rehab every house in this quarter square mile. So there are about 100 vacant structures. The phases are the ones you see in purple. They constitute about 194 dwelling units because some of them are duplexes. And then at the core is the Herman Kiefer development, and I said that's 800,000 square feet, including 3 schools. So what's the strategy if you're rehabbing houses and building nothing? Well, part of it is to set up, again, a relationship between the lot next door and the house that's rehabbed. And so the landscape architects came up with this idea of hedgerows and trees, so that instead of having a chain link fence between you and the property, a hedge would be developed that would create a pattern over the course of its many blocks, much like in Lafayette Park. And then what you would begin to see is, as this strategy is deployed, a signature look for the neighborhood emerges. So the house, the hedgerow, and then the next scale is how do you make the land which is not tied to a house productive? And for that, the landscape architect wanted to create a series of tree nurseries. These would be commercial nurseries in the neighborhood. So it's the forestry option. What if we planted 10,000 trees in this neighborhood, but they would not be exclusively for reforesting, they would be for sale. And so the concept is quite simple. On every lot, there's a typology of tree nurseries that are established. Some of them have a standing group in the middle. Some of them are in rows. Some of them are perimeter conditioned with a public space down the center of them. And this would create, again, try to create an economic value of the land, and at the same time allow it to be porous and public. And with the first one of these pilots to be built is this one. So the standing trees around the perimeter are permanent. The trees you see in the center lots are potted and are for sale. And as these trees grow, they can be planted throughout the neighborhood to create, again, a signature of that neighborhood. And the 3 houses are repurposed for commercial enterprise. Thanks. And this is a kind of rendition of what some of this might look like. So we are in the process of trying to figure out the economic model, because instead of 20 acres like we had in Fitzgerald, here we have 40 acres in a single quarter square mile that has to be repurposed. And then you put the strategies together, and this is what you would have. The other part of this is the adaptive reuse. So at the center of this neighborhood resides this mega hospital, historic hospital, 800,000 square feet, with 3 schools. It's probably one of the largest preservation projects in the state. But you can imagine what it must take if we've got 100 homes to fill, what it would take to fill 800,000 square feet. So the strategy that we have developed is a tactical one, where you begin to occupy strategically some portion of this mega structure with new uses that attract users. So in the school, the auditorium is being repurposed as an indoor youth skate park. And the rest of the building is being mothballed so that it will gradually find its use when finances and program permit. And when you have something that large, the only way to approach it is tactically. And you have to understand that we have over 100,000 buildings that are vacant. We have about 60 schools that are vacant, cathedrals, libraries, factories, recreation centers. So in order to really tackle this, you have to be strategic. Then at the core of the project is a public space that connects the street, reclaims it as 12th Street, but not in the way of reconstructing a main street, but instead trying to connect the pieces of a shopping center, a recreation center, and taking half of what is a 4-lane divided and bringing it down to 2 lanes and making public space of the rest. And this will connect to the Herman Kiefer complex. So, unless you think the only thing we do is plant trees and hedge walls, I thought I'd talk to you lastly about the missing middle. There are some neighborhoods in Detroit where the market wants to go to build a medium density neighborhood again, and this is Brush Park. So Brush Park is adjacent to the downtown core, and the real game changer for Brush Park and urban density was the opening of our first light rail down Woodward. It only goes now for about 4 miles, but instantaneously every neighborhood to the east and the west of this line became overnight practically a transit-oriented neighborhood where you could walk to transit within 10 minutes from most neighborhoods that line it. And like most areas of Detroit, the city owns an incredible amount of vacant land. So this is adjacent. It's a little old because they since built an arena nearby, but this is Brush Park on the lower part of the slide. And the city owns about 60% of the land in that quarter square mile. So the first project that I was interested in was, can we predict what the form of that neighborhood will and should be using a kind of form-based code? And I'll explain to you a little bit about this strategy that was an outgrowth of the first development project and why the form was so important. This was one of the first new buildings before my time, but this is one building that stretches the entire length of the block in a neighborhood that's made up of stately single lot mansions. And so what happens here is this is a negotiated zoning, and it actually does not impact the form. And instead, this is a development, it's called City Modern, that was based on a set of design guidelines and form-based codes. And what you see here, in contrast to the other example, are 7 different typologies within a block and a half, with varying densities and varying architects. There are 5 different architects in operating in this one development project. It involves the missing middle. That means all those that are bigger than a single family house and smaller than a mid-rise building. So your carriage houses, your townhouses, your bungalows, your triplexes and quadruplexes, your live work. And could you create a fabric of the neighborhood that felt and looked like the traditional qualities that neighborhoods that have been built over time have, but to do it in a contemporary architectural expression? That was the challenge. And this was the plan that won the proposal. And what you see here are 4 corner buildings, which are the taller apartment buildings. All 4 of these buildings are designed by Loha, Lorcan O'Halloran, who will be lecturing here in a few weeks. And they also involve buildings, again, that incrementally increase the density. These are still stick-built buildings. Corner retail at its base. And the massing is strategic in that it sculpts the rooftops so that they take advantage of the downtown views and provides that semi-outdoor space for families. But it also reactivates the alley. So these are the alley units where garages can be used for workspace, and you create a kind of safe space for families with children. Or another density. So you can begin to see the variety of types all within a block and a half. As I said, the thing that allowed us to achieve this level of design were codes. The other main goal was to see if we could recover some of these incredible mansions. So that upper left hand was this mansion just 15 years ago. And you're seeing it over the course. This photographer, Vergara, would come back every other year and he would photograph it. I don't think he expected to see the lower right-hand image where this mansion has been completely restored. And the goal was to do a contemporary architecture that could stand across or next to such an incredible historic resource and have, again, a sense of detail, a sense of excellence. And so these projects, this area is currently under construction. And it all was guided by a set of guidelines. So this was the sheet that the designers were given as they were asked to deal with the corner buildings. Next. And the goal really is to regulate the form and allow for an architectural variety to happen. So, I like to say, I couldn't care less if it's traditional or modern. I just want it to be good. But we are leaning towards the modern because I firmly believe that contemporary architecture, when coded correctly, can produce the same kind of traditional delight we get in some of the historic neighborhoods. So our zoning code, sorry for that, our zoning ordinance kind of reads like this. It's about a 100-page document, and our goal was to reduce it to 2 pages. So for each typology, there are 2 pages. Everything you need to know about what you're supposed to do is contained in 2 pages. And we tested out a variety of typologies to see if we could get 6 units onto a single lot, see if we could get 8 units, if we could create the scalar, something that fit within that neighborhood scale. And we gave them instructions on how to address parking, how to create addresses, and this code is adopted by the city. And so if you follow the code, instead of something taking 6 months to get through, it gets 6 weeks. And so you can also play out scenarios for what the rest of the neighborhood might look like over the next 5, 10, and 15 years. So to test this idea, we put out an RFP recently for 1 block to see what a designer developer would do. And you can see, you can look at the variety of density. There are streets that should be taller. There are streets that are more row house-like. There are streets like the blue, which are high density at a transit stop. And the result we got was this. So this is a higher density block based on those simple typologies and codes. And so I would say that it's working, that the architectural quality is such and the density is such that I can begin to see how this neighborhood will evolve over time. So there's so much more I could talk about, but just to let you know where we're going, we have completed 4 neighborhood frameworks that are now moving into implementation. We've just onboarded 4 more design consultants, and you can see out until 2019 the areas of development that we intend to focus on. And even with those, we will only be about through a third of the neighborhoods. And so we will just keep adding more and more neighborhoods as we go on in time. So if there are a few things that I hope you will take away from the talk is at the foundation of all of this is a respect for history, for those buildings that we have been entrusted, and our obligation to reuse them and adapt them for the next generation. A respect for nature that is going to be an integral part of the future of the city of Detroit. Respect for beauty. Even middle-aged African-American men like to take pictures of butterflies. To be able to do this in your neighborhood. A respect for a variety of modes of transportation and the freedom of cycling. A respect for local entrepreneurs. On many of those commercial streets, the goal is to populate them with locally owned businesses. Respect for work and the dignity that work gives you. And just being mindful that ultimately we're doing it for the next generation, for our young people. And then lastly, just respect for communities' voices and their right to be integrally involved in the planning of their neighborhoods. Thank you very much.